Okay, so the basic reason why the tribal fighting was so prevalent when I was in Papua New Guinea in 1980 was that during the colonial era, when British or often Australian district officers and other officials managed the country, they set up tribal courts as well. There was the European model of law that was set up, but in addition, there were traditional courts. And so if a dispute arose over an accusation of theft or a rape or some other thing between two neighboring tribal groups, then it would go to usually the elders would take it to a traditional court, of which the DO or some other European or non-indigenous official would render judgment. Now, however ignorant or stupid or unfortunate these officials were, at least they were not accused of being biased in favor of one side or the other. Then independence came in 1975, and so by 1980, people were unwilling to take these disputes to the traditional court, because with independence, indigenous Papua New Guineans were the judges, were officials in the court, both the tribal court as well as the more European-style legal system. And nobody could possibly believe that such a person hadn't been bought off, hadn't been put under a spell by witchcraft in some other way, be favoring one side or the other. So people did not trust these tribal courts anymore to render a reasonable judgment. And so the tribal warfare was the option they took up. Now, books have been written about this, suggesting that the basic reason for tribal warfare in the highlands was acquisition of new land. I saw evidence that they were showing me land that they had captured from the enemy 10, 20 years before. They still didn't use. It was, I had an alternate explanation that had much more to do with witchcraft and long-standing disputes between people centering around witchcraft beliefs. And sure enough, after my host, who ran a little co-op, he was sort of one of the more modern, shall we say, people in the community after he had been killed, and it was absolutely devastating for the village, for the community. Everybody was in absolute tears. There was, from morning to night and all night long, there was nothing but cries of wailing all around the village. I couldn't get any of my student friends who had brought me there to give me any explanation of what was going on. They were all tied up in their own family things. People started flocking in from communities all over the place, and I was just a sort of wandered around trying to make sense of what was going on. I figured out they were doing forms of divination to find out how the enemy had acquired its magic, because obviously this was such an unusual event, this death of my host, that it had to have been by magic and that. So anyway, it was a very stressful as well as interesting. Then one of the other students who I'd met in Port Moresby happened to be passing by and dropped in and found me, and they said, "Hey, I got to take you away from this. This is you. I'll take you to my village." His village was 3 or 4 days hike off in the mountains, way away from any thing. I was given a place to sleep in the house with the women and the pigs, literally in the same hut. And and lo and behold, the situation there was they were in a valley with 3 clans, and I was in Clan C, shall we say. A fight broke out between Clan A and Clan B. Clan C held a big meeting. We can't stay out of this. We have to. And so they picked sides. Some of them went with the enemy, with Clan A. And they had tribal fighting the next day. I said, "Aren't you afraid of killing one of your own clanmates?" "Oh, no. When you throw an arrow, you know who it's going to. You just throw it somewhere else." So, as I say, there was this thing. It was like a soccer match you couldn't keep out of. And next thing you know, I'm up on the hillside with the old men and the ladies, and the young men are bringing us cool water to drink, and we're having fun watching things. When this helicopter comes in about to drop, and they looked like they were going to drop tear gas on us. And one of these helicopters, it came so close, I could see the whites of the Australian pilot's eyes, and I waved to him, showing him that I was European, and he went away. But, and then we went back to Port Moresby, and I mean, it's extraordinary. The Pacific Arts Festival was in full swing. Somebody fainted on the beach in the middle of, they were watching these races with these outrigger canoes. Somebody fainted. To get the ambulance in there, they threw tear gas into the crowd. I couldn't believe it. But anyway, that's Papua New Guinea. And so finally I left. I was finally in conversation with people in the bureaucracy that handles research permits. And he said, "Come as a visitor anyway." It was clear, I find Indonesians extremely difficult. They're not straightforward at all. There's always, you never quite understand what's going on. Anyway, I think he must have known all along that Mentu Islands, he'll never even. And they tried to stop me. I got to Andalas and to Andalas University and hooked up with my research partner, and we took the ferry across. And next thing I know, the police grab me as I'm getting off the boat, take me into the police station, and tell me I'm not allowed to. I must stay there in the little ferry terminal area, a little town there, but very small. And I immediately walked out of this place, and the forest was just there. I went straight into the forest because I knew there was a team from the World Wildlife Fund had made some arrangement with the Indonesian government. Survival International, which is a British-based thing, and the World Wildlife Fund had put money in to try and protect, first of all, are interested in some species of gibbon that were up in the hills. They're clear-cutting forestry in this area, and they're moving the Aboriginal people out from their villages up on the rivers where they can live and have, down to the coast, and where it was much, it was a horrendous situation. It became very clear to me that I would not get official government permission to do the research. I hung out with these people I spent one night with these people from World Wildlife Fund, and probably through them I got malaria, or at least they had. And luckily, before I left Canada, I'd been given a new medication. In addition to the quinine pills that you take, that they had a new medication called Fansidar, and I hadn't used it. But once the malaria didn't attack me until I'd left Indonesia, gone through Malaysia. I was an Aeroflot flight that took me from Malaysia to Delhi, and then I got a flight up to Ladakh. This is an area in the Himalayas that I'd read about. It's just a magical area, Buddhist area that is very magical. Anyway, by that time, the malaria hit. I was about a week basically lying up on the flat roof of the pension. They brought my food to me when I could eat. And I took those Fansidar, and they got the malaria out of my body, because I've been tested since. Malaria often stays in the liver, but in my case, I got rid of it. But so anyway, that experience in Indonesia, particularly, and these people were obviously they were much darker colored. They were probably an indigenous population to Indonesia, and certainly were not. And Sumatra is one of the most. That was the other bizarre thing. By the time I got there, it was Ramadan, and my assistant, who was a great cook, but he refused to do anything but lie down all day long, So I went off on my own and did the best I could, talking to villagers and that, or sign language, and with my little Indonesian phrase book, trying to make myself understood. And then I'd come back and he'd make these magnificent meals after the sun had gone down. It was also durian season. I don't know if you've ever been to Indonesia. It's an amazing place. So anyway, it was a lot of fun, but really nothing in terms of my career came out of it, and I've never written up this stuff. So got back to the next sort of years were very much writing up, I guess, political stuff, doing support work with indigenous groups in Newfoundland and Labrador. ISA Books, the publisher for the Memorial University for Social Sciences, had bought the rights to my first book, Bringing Home Animals. And so that was selling quite well. And then 3 different manuscripts arrived from 3 different Scandinavian anthropologists who'd worked in Canada. Tord Larsen in Nova Scotia, Bear Brock in the Northwest Territories. Very interesting. And I was asked to edit these and make a book out of them. They were all fairly short pieces, shorter than a full book themselves. And so that I wrote that introductory piece on what I call the politics of Indianness, trying to figure out what ethnic politics was for Indigenous people at the time. In some ways, ethnic politics relates to immigrant politics, the politics of non-Indigenous people who form minorities. What's different about the Aboriginal people is they don't have a homeland to go back to, that they don't want to be classified along with Indigenous people as kind of, and also they didn't ask to be integrated as Canadians into Canadian society. Yes, it's happening to them. I mean, I guess this is one of the dominant, apart from what was called structural functionalism in those days, the tendency to explain most of things in anthropology by having some either hidden or popular function, way of making society work. The other dominant thing was God, what's the word I'm looking for? Was acculturation, that particularly Indigenous people were on their way to becoming just like non-native Canadians. They were bit by bit being acculturated, despite whatever they wanted. And the McGill Cree project was very much in line with that kind of thinking. And my thinking has developed to said that there is the opportunity for Aboriginal people, yes, to some degree acculturate, yes, to become part of the Canadian mosaic of cultures, but to some degree on their own terms, to maintain their own identities. And that you've seen that rise of that. I don't think even anthropologists at the time of Hawthorne and all of that interest in native peoples basically accepted the idea that eventually they're going to disappear. They're just going to become absorbed into the mainstream. We're just sort of documenting the end days. But since I think earlier than most people, I disputed that view and looked at the future of minority groups and ethnic groups, particularly in minorities, and how they can maintain a distinct identity and still live in the modern world, because they can't avoid that modern world. So, while my thesis focused very much on I felt this was an opportunity to document something that probably was not going to last. That those ways of hunting, the ways of dealing with the animals and the animal spirits, and those that I had a precious opportunity to see that and to document that. But I was under no illusion that this could not survive into the. But my concern was, both in Labrador with my work with Indigenous people there, that it was their choice how to move. Whereas, obviously, the previous, right up to I think the break came in 1969 with the White Paper. Up to that point, white men knew best. It was white men making the agenda for Aboriginal people. And it's only since they've been able to represent themselves through their own political organizations, and they've made mistakes, that it's not always gone well, but at least they are finding their own way in the modern world under their own terms. And that I've seen that change through my lifetime. It's been, even though it's very sad, the story that I've witnessed, from the Inuit as they were in Inukjuak in 1957 to all of the horrendous things in youth suicide, in alcohol abuse, in all of the what I call social suffering. And that has been the most recent, I guess, starting in the 90s. I started, first of all, wonder why anthropology hasn't dealt with this. It seemed to me amazing that you don't, up until the 90s, you don't read, and yet it had been going on, this tragic situation in Canada, which obviously had happened in the States much earlier, but and under different, with much more violent and that. But nevertheless, this was, you know, for Hawthorne not to have pointed that out. I talked to people on the Hawthorne team who was aware of the alcohol problem. You know, I think fairly recently alcohol had become legal for Aboriginal people. And that sort of thing. And the question isn't, are they susceptible to alcohol or why did they drink? But, well, it's more why are they suffering the kind of unhappiness, you know, basic unhappiness, people to turn to this drink. They weren't that way when I saw them, you know, in the bush. Nobody thought didn't need alcohol as a way. They were drinking when they were in the summertime by then, but it you know, and so it's that underlying psychological distress from loss of autonomy, so many things that were lost in that period from the 60s, 70s, you know, basically starting in the 50s, through that and it happened much. The other thing, as a teacher, I have to be aware of not, you know, I teach, there's no course on the Cree. I would teach courses on much larger scale. So I've always had an inclination to the comparative approach, to seeing how, so, you know, I've always seen the James Bay Cree as incredibly fortunate compared to similar groups in other parts of the Canadian North. I mean, the comparison with Attawabascat is being made every time Attawabascat comes in the news. How come they're so bad? You know, and you can see the reasons. The Cree were so fortunate to, first of all, maintain a traditional way of life, right up to when they were able to sign an agreement that gave them power to make their own decisions, not to be administered by somebody else. And they've used that power. You know, there's a lot of, you can criticize the prevalence of lawyers among the Cree. They are so dependent on their own lawyers, but they use those lawyers to insist on the letter of, you know, so they've taken the Quebec government, the federal government, various private companies to court many, many times. And, you know, that has been, made them one of the more successful Indigenous groups, particularly in the North, you know, who don't have access to money-making enterprises as yet of their own. So anyway, I've also been a scholar of the fur trade. Again, somewhat of an outsider. The fur trade literature is written by people who pore over the intricate details of the Hudson Bay Company records or the records of other traders. And I felt that a lot of that literature was so myopically concerned with the trader's perspective. And, you know, it's a much more hard work. And the traders knew something about what was going on with their customers, the Indigenous people. But you had to do a lot more work to dig and that. And so, again, in writing Bringing Home Animals and in writing other books, where I deal with the fur trade, I see that the Indigenous people generally had a lot more power in that trade relationship than they're usually given credit for. And so that has interested me, how they manage to do that. The Labrador case presented me when I was doing my research on the occupation of the Innu. You have a different group who came in who were part Inuit, part European descent. They moved from the coast up, and the Europeans had been fishermen, and moved up into Upper Lake Melville and became the main trappers for the Hudson Bay Company. They set up their own individual, each trapper had its own trap line up one of the major rivers. It was a totally different way of trapping than the Cree followed, or the Innu in Labrador. And it was much more in line with the Hudson Bay, market-oriented. They would trap only those species that happened to be high-priced that year. They would, whereas the Cree they were mainly hunters who were interested in meat. But to get that meat, you needed guns and ammunition. So you trapped a little on the side to get those things you needed. But their focus was on self-provisioning, I call it, which means the food that you're going to eat, you provide for yourself. And the house you lived in, your tent, your all of the things you need, your fuel for your fire, is produced by your own efforts, not by going to the store. And I saw that in Fiji later on, an economy that is totally focused around self-provisioning. It may engage with the capitalist market. They may need things from factories and that they can't produce themselves, but the logic of the economic motivation, why you get up, what your motivation is entirely different from somebody who works for wages or a businessman who maximizes profit and that kind of thing. And it's that separate self-provisioning which still exists in large areas of the world. We're being told that the poor, are starving, they're only making $1 a day or something. We're being given a distorted view of poverty in the third world. Yes, those that have moved to cities who depend on jobs and that are in a critical situation when prices change and that they're very vulnerable. But self-provisioning people, although it's not as glamorous and maybe it's not, it isn't high tech and that maybe people think they're losing out by remaining in those villages, making their own living. But from my point of view, it's been overlooked as an important aspect of how people live. And so, that's something I'm interested in still, even though, I find myself stuck in these things that are obviously on their way out. They're not fashionable anymore. Hunting and trapping by the Cree is dying. Self-provisioning, these are the economies that I admire, but are obviously, I can't deny the reality that the modern world is carrying people with it in ways that making that kind of way of life impossible.